Hello and welcome to this bite-sized webinar series. My name is Kerry Hammick and I'm a consultant with the compliance people. And today I'll be talking you through hazardous waste consignment notes in England and Wales. So in this webinar, we will cover the basic duties of the Hazardous Waste England and Wales Regulations 2005 and the Hazardous Waste Wales Regulations 2005. We'll refer to both as the Hazardous Waste Regulations 2005. Information required on a hazardous waste consignment note, how to correctly complete a hazardous waste consignment note, and consignee returns, what they are and what the requirements are. So we'll begin by going through the Hazardous Waste Regulations 2005 for both England and Wales. If you produce, transport or receive hazardous waste, then you'll be regulated by the Hazardous Waste Regulations. Mixing of hazardous waste with any other waste, whether or not it's hazardous, is banned, so this shouldn't be happening on your site. For each movement or transfer of hazardous waste, you need to complete what's called a consignment note. You need to keep records of these consignment notes for a minimum of 3 years, unless you're a hazardous waste carrier, in which case it needs to be kept for a minimum of 12 months. Your duty of care under Section 34 of the Environmental Protection Act still applies. So, for example, you must still be registered as a waste carrier if you're moving waste around. And the Waste Regulations 2011 also still apply. Consignees are required by the regulations to send returns to producers and holders, and also to the Environment Agency and/or Natural Resources Wales. The consignee is the recipient of the waste. Each quarter, they must send a return to producers or holders who send waste to them and also to the relevant environmental regulator. This return details what hazardous waste was sent to them and how it was disposed of and/or recovered. We'll now move on to an overview of the general requirements. So, when you're completing a hazardous waste consignment note, you'll need a description of the waste, any processes the waste has been through, how the waste is contained and/or packaged, the quantity of the waste, so where possible, what is the weight of it, the place and the date of the transfer or movement of waste. We'll need details of the permit, license or exemption of the person receiving the waste. Need to include the license or registration number of the person handing over the waste, if they have a waste management license, an environmental permit or are a registered carrier of controlled waste. You need to include the appropriate European Waste Catalogue or EWC code, also the standard industry code, the SIC Code of your business, and also a statement that the waste hierarchy has been applied. The law is very specific about what hazardous waste consignment notes must contain, so it's really important that nothing is missed. Also, auditors really love to check this kind of thing, so it's important that you get it right. I appreciate it's quite a comprehensive list of things to include, so we're going to go over these in more detail throughout the webinar. Next, we'll look at more about what's required on a hazardous waste consignment note. When using a hazardous waste consignment note, you must use the specified form as set out in the regulations and in the regulator's guidance. This means that the consignment note will be valid as it will include all the relevant information fields. It needs to be as near as possible to the format in any example notes provided by the regulator, as near as that as possible. It has 5 parts, A to E, and each part must be filled out in order by the right person at the right time. You need one for every movement of hazardous waste, and you must correctly classify the waste, and you can do this using Technical Guidance WM3, which we'll talk about a bit later. And you must prepare the consignment note before the waste is moved. You're not meant to do it during or afterwards. The waste will be rejected by the receiving site if it has been incorrectly coded, so it's important that you get this right. Do not use a consignment note if any of the information fields are missing or have been altered or reduced and change what's required. For example, the email, phone or number or weight is missing, or the declarations are worded differently, or the format is different. For example, if it doesn't have separate tables in Part B and Part E. Here on the right-hand side, you can see a Hazardous Consignment Note template, and this template is available on the Environment Agency or the Natural Resources Wales website, and it should be used or replicated to ensure that all the necessary information is included. There's more detail required on it compared to a waste transfer note, and it's the duty of each person in the chain to check that the section completed before them is correct, and they have to sign to say that they've done this. Each movement of waste is called a consignment, hence the term consignment note. We'll now go through the separate parts of the consignment note, starting with Part A. So this is completed by the producer or the holder of the waste, and they should have 3 copies and give all 3 once they're completed to the carrier. It needs to contain a unique consignment note code, the name, address and telephone number and email of where the waste is to be removed from, the name and address of where the waste is to be taken to, and the name, address, telephone number and email of the waste producer if different from where the waste is to be removed from. Usually 3 copies are produced, but this can be more depending on where and how the waste is transported. As I said, all 3 copies need to be completed and given to the carrier, so this part should be produced by the waste producer. The consignment code will be explained in the next slide, as there's a specific way to formulate this, and it's really important that this code is correct. I'll start by going through consignment note codes in England, as they're slightly different compared to Wales. If you produce hazardous waste in England, you used to have to register as a hazardous waste producer with the Environment Agency. However, from April 2016, this was no longer required, although it is still a requirement in Wales. This changed the format of the unique consignment note code. So you can see here the format. The first 6 letters should be the first 6 letters of the company name, and then the next part should be 6 numbers or letters of your choosing, and these should be unique. So, for example, if I was doing it for the compliance people, the first 6 letters of the consignment note would be the com, and the next 6 letters or numbers would be 6 letters and numbers of my choosing. It's quite helpful to have a system in place for generating these numbers though, so you don't lose track. The first part, so the first 6 letters of the company, stays the same for every consignment. It's only the last part that needs to be unique for each time the waste leaves the premises. As I mentioned, consignment note codes in Wales are slightly different. In Wales, you still have to register as a hazardous waste producer. If you do so, you'll get what's known as a premises code, and this is what should be used to form the first part of the consignment note code. All premises codes in Wales start with a C. So the first part of this, for example, would be CA000. The second part is similar to how you do them in England. You would either use 5 unique numbers and letters of your choosing if you're using a premises code, or 8 if there's not a premises code and the hazardous waste producer is exempt. So if that's the case, in the first part of your consignment note code, rather than the premises code, you would put EXE for exempt. So you can see the example on the slide would be CA00/0029M. The first part stays the same for each consignment, and the second part needs to be unique each time the waste leaves the premises. The next part of the consignment note is Part B, and this section should be completed by the waste producer or holder. It needs to have a description of the process that created the waste. We need to have the SIC code, so that's the Standard Industry Classification Code. We need the waste details, so a description of it, for example, fluorescent tubes. We need the EWC code. This is the European Waste Catalogue Code, which I'll explain in more detail later on. We need the quantity of waste, so the waste in kilograms, and any chemical, biological components of the waste, for example, mercury. and these can be identified on a safety data sheet. We need to know the physical form of the waste. So is it a gas, a liquid, powder, sludge, is it mixed? And we also need to know the container type and amount. For each EWC code, we will need the hazard codes, and you can use a guidance document called WM3, Appendix C for this, which again I will explain in more detail later on. And you may also need the UN identification numbers, the proper shipping names, the UN classes, the packing groups, and the special handling requirements for shipping of dangerous goods if applicable. There are 3 methods to work out if a waste displays hazardous properties, and these are calculation, so it's referring to a concentration limit for a hazard statement code or codes, testing, to prove whether a particular hazardous property is present or not, and this is typically used for the physical properties, so for example explosive, oxidizing or flammable. And the third method is using the safety data sheet if the waste is the same chemical composition. If a product has a hazardous pictogram, then a hazardous property is likely to apply, although be aware that the absence of one doesn't mean it doesn't need one though. Often, the hazardous waste contractor will help you fill this in, but it's your responsibility to ensure that it's correct. So in part B, we spoke about a SIC code. What is a SIC code? SIC stands for Standard Industry Classification, and it's a 4-digit code, which is a system of classifying industries. It's used for financial and business administration mostly, and an example of a SIC code for a company that manufactures paper and paperboard would be 1712. You may also see this written as 17.12 too, and that's because that was the old way of writing SIC codes. So it's not a big deal if the dot's there, as long as the numbers are correct. If you're not sure what the SIC code is for your company, then you can check this on Companies House, and the link showed on the slide here. And also, if you search for your company on Companies House, when it comes up, it will list the correct SIC code. You need to make sure that the SIC code is correct and that it's on all hazardous waste consignment notes, as this is quite a common mistake we see when we're auditing them. Auditors quite often check for this kind of thing, so it's worth making sure that it's right. When coding waste, it's useful to use a guidance document called WM3. And this has been produced by the Environment Agency and other regulators, such as Natural Resources Wales, as a technical guidance document to provide guidance on waste classification. And it's quite a comprehensive reference manual for anyone who's producing, managing, or regulating waste. And Appendix A is the key bit, as this includes the waste classification codes. These codes can also be referred to as LOW codes, List of Waste, or EWC, European Waste Catalogue codes, and these are for hazardous and non-hazardous waste. The document doesn't provide guidance on the packaging and labelling of waste for transport. Just a word of warning, WM3 is 185 pages long, so it's a bit of a hefty document, and the key bit to remember for identifying the waste codes, as I said before, is Appendix A. It can be quite complicated to use, as there's a particular way it should be read and an order in which to check the chapters in Appendix A. But this is unfortunately beyond the scope of the training today. You just need to know what the most common waste codes are for your company or site. And the Environment Agency have a useful document on this, which can be seen on the slide here, the link. However, it's best to use the full guide in WM3 to make sure that you're coding correctly. When we identify waste codes, we want to know exactly what the waste is and where it's come from. And this is done by using a 6-digit code. And the wastes are listed according to the industrial process and/or business activity that created them. Hazardous wastes have an asterisk against them. For example, 1305 asterisk, as you can see on the slide. The list of wastes and/or EWC contains 20 chapters that relate either to a process that generated the waste or to specific waste types. And the chapters are given a 2-digit number. So for example, Chapter 20, which is a common one because this is municipal waste, so household waste and other similar commercial and or industrial and institutional wastes. And then 15, which is another common one, as this is waste packaging, absorbents, wiping cloths, filter materials and protective clothing, not other specified. So it's worth bearing in mind that an asterisk means it's a hazardous waste. And as we're looking at hazardous waste consignment notes, these are the codes that will be key. The next part of the consignment note is Part C. And this part is completed by the waste carrier when they've checked parts A and B. If the round is part of a multiple collection, so more than one load of hazardous waste being collected by the carrier, then the round number and the collection number should be included within this section. You also need the name, address and vehicle details of the carrier, the details of the waste carrier's registration, so what their registration number is, and then it will also need a signature, date and time completed by the waste carrier. After this, the carrier will take the waste away. They should leave you with a note, but Part E will not yet be completed. Next we have Part D, and this is completed by the consignor. And the consignor is the name of the person who supervises the carrier collection and signs the note. So they will complete this once they've checked parts A, B and C. And they must be present when the waste is collected. Must include the name, address and telephone number and email address. Confirm that the waste hierarchy has been applied. Sign, date and time this part of the note. And then they will keep one copy of the note and give the other copies to the waste carrier. We'll now talk a bit about the waste hierarchy. The waste hierarchy has been required since 2011 and it was introduced by the Waste Framework Directive. It identifies 5 steps for dealing with waste in order of priority. It shows the order of priority you should apply when making decisions about the resources used and the waste generated by your business. And it takes account of the environmental impact of the different waste management options. So at the top, you've got prevention, which is the best option, and then you move further down to the least preferable option, which is disposal. There'll be a statement within the hazardous waste consignment note to say that you've confirmed your duty to apply the waste hierarchy, and you need to tick this box and sign to say that you've done this. All parties in the chain must apply the waste hierarchy. And it's also a requirement if you have an environmental permit. An example of where the waste hierarchy would not have been applied is if a company throws all of their waste into the same skip without any segregation. The last part of the consignment note is Part E, and this is completed by the site accepting the waste, known as the consignee. On this section, you'll have the address of the site receiving the waste and the time that they received it. They will confirm that the EWC codes and quantities recorded are correct. They will state if the waste was accepted or rejected, and the recovery or disposal operation to be applied to that waste. They'll also put their name, address, telephone and email address, and their permit number or waste exemption number. And then finally, they will sign, date and time it. Part E should be returned to you, and this might be in the form of an individual note or by quarterly returns. And this is so you know what's happened to the hazardous waste that you've had collected. Under the regulations, the consignee has an obligation to do what's called consignee returns. And this is information that needs to be submitted quarterly to the regulator, which tells them what hazardous wastes have been accepted and how they've been recovered and or disposed of. This also needs to be sent to the waste producer in regards to the hazardous waste that they've sent to the consignee. So as I mentioned, Part E, or the information within it, should be returned to the producer. There should be individual notes and or quarterly returns. The best practice is to attach it to the original note, and the consignment notes must be retained for a minimum of 3 years. Often the consignees send back Part E, as this is easier. So finally, to recap, in part A, we have the waste location, the producer name, and the producer's address. We have the consignee address, so this is where the waste is to be taken to. In part B, we have the waste description, the EWC code or codes if there's more than one waste stream, and also any hazardous codes and the SIC code. In part C, we have the waste carrier's name and address and their registration details, so they should be registered with the Environment Agency or Natural Resources Wales. And then in part C and D, we have two signatures, one from the carrier and one from the consignor. And this is to say that the information in parts A, B and C is correct. And the address should be the same as in part A. And then finally, in part E, we've got the waste receipts signed name, so the consignee, the name and address and permit number or exemption details, and the date, time and signature for delivery. Thank you very much for watching this webinar. I hope you found it useful. The Compliance People is the UK's leading provider of environment and health and safety compliance management services, and we've got lots more resources and guidance available, and you can find these if you head over to our website, thecompliancepeople.co.uk. Thank you again for listening.